Hi everyone, and welcome to our discussion tonight with Professor Anthony Reddie, Director of the Centre for Religion and Culture at Regents Park College at the University of Oxford, and a Professor Extraordinarious in the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systemic Theology at the University of South Africa. So hi and welcome again everyone. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our Professor Reddie here, kindly accepting our invitation to take part in today's discussion. And also for our viewers, I'm sure you're as excited for the dialogue as I am too, as I have no doubt it will be a very stimulating discussion. So we're here tonight to discuss the issue of racism, experience of it in the UK, the Black Lives Matter movement, and why the movement originated in the US has had such a large impact, not only in the US, also around the globe, and of course here, specifically in the UK. The format will be in a series of questions, first proposed by myself, and then hopefully an engagement with our live audience. So thank you all again for being here with us today. So I'd like to get straight into my first question. Although it may seem like a simple question, I think it's important and vital to start with the terms that we're using. So what do we mean by racism, and how does it resonate in the UK in comparison to perhaps the US?
Indeed. Okay. So in order to understand racism, we perhaps have to backtrack a little bit and talk about the concept of race, because if you don't have the concept of race, then you don't have racism. So race is a construct. It's an idea. It's not a factual thing in terms of biology or in terms of anything that can be measured as a particular phenomenon. So basically, it has its roots kind of in the Enlightenment, maybe sort of pre-Enlightenment. And essentially, its roots really come from the sense of Europeans when they encounter other people from other parts of the world, particularly Africa, and particularly linked to the transatlantic slave trade and wanting to enslave African people. There becomes this sense of, well, you need a kind of rationale in order to treat other human beings as chattel. If you want to treat them as objects, treat them as things that you can exploit for profit, spectacular profit, then essentially what you need is some rationale. And so there emerges, therefore, this idea of race that essentially there are fixed biological differences between peoples, and they are ranked in a kind of hierarchy. So at the top of the hierarchy is white Europeans, especially Northern Europeans. So people who would see themselves as tracing their lineage to the Anglo-Saxons, they would see themselves as perhaps being superior to, let's say, to people who come from the Mediterranean. However, and then in that hierarchy, you have all the different groups with Black Africans at the bottom. So essentially, the concept of race is this idea that one group of people, particularly white Europeans, are superior to. They have bigger brains, they've got bigger intellects. You can see that in terms of their development of cities compared to Africa, that is largely rural and seen as backward and seen as inferior. So all these is taken as evidence of the superiority of one group over another. So that's the concept of race. As I said, it is imagined because there's only really one race, and that's a human race. Mm-hmm. And so in some of the better books, race is always put in inverted commas to say, well, this is it's an idea. It's something that's made up, and it's so made up that at various points we can't even agree how many races there are. So at one point there were 4 races, another time there were 8, another time there were 16, then it was back down to 5 again. At one point in the Spanish Empire, in the 17th and 18th century, there was something like 128 races, which looking back, of course, is absurd. Race is absurd. Actually, the only 2 specific things that mark as different in terms of race is eye color. So if you are white and European, you're more likely to have blue eyes or eyes that's like, if you come from other parts of the world, you're more likely to have brown eyes. That's one marker, which is tiny. The other one is skin color, which obviously is the one that is often seen as the presenting issue, i.e. skin color, is the problem. But actually, that again is just a biological feature of people who come from tropical climates, that essentially, like, you need melanin in your skin so your skin doesn't burn. That's all it is. And relatively superficial. Everything else, we are pretty much the same. So what I often say to many white people is that if I had an accident, it's just as likely that a white person not from my family could give me a blood transfusion or an organ transfusion as anyone in my own family. There's not black blood, white blood, Indian blood, Muslim blood. It's nonsense. Race is a construct. All that said, racism is real. So racism are policies, practices, systems, ways of operating that effectively are based on or are conditioned by or are influenced by the concept of race. So, for example, let me just give one quick example. So my parents come from the Caribbean, and they come particularly from the island of Jamaica. Britain in the Second World War wins the war. Well, if we're more accurate, actually, it's the Russians and the Americans who win the war. Actually, it's really the Russians, because actually they lose 30 million people. So they're the ones who effectively did all the heavy lifting in terms of beating Hitler. But even so, Britain rightly celebrates. But of course, now, because it's got a problem, it's lost lots of men. The infrastructure's damaged. It needs essentially an influx of labour to come and to help rebuild the country. Therefore, one of the ways it conceives of this, it passes the 1948 Commonwealth Nationality Act that says effectively all these people who are part of the British Empire, about 800 million of them, all of them, if they wanted to, although of course it's unlikely that all of them could come, have the right to come to Britain to work. And what's clear when you look at the documents that come out of the Home Office and the Foreign Office when in the 1940s, when they're about to draft this act, is that what they really meant by the Commonwealth and what they really wanted was the white Commonwealth to come back. So that's the white settler colonies of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And remember, this is South Africa in the days of apartheid, so it's the white majority, it's the white minority. Those are the people that they really want to come back. But of course, they're not the people who come. The people who do come are the black and brown people from Africa, the Caribbean, and from the Indian subcontinent. And immediately they come, this causes alarm in Britain, and essentially every immigration act that's been passed since has been trying to find a way to allow white people from the Commonwealth back in, but keep black and brown people out. So one of the classic examples is the 1988 Nationality Reform Act. This is an act passed by Margaret Thatcher's government as a way of trying to reform the earlier immigration acts that were passed. And this one says, if you live in a Commonwealth, if you live in a country that was part of the British Empire, you can come back in and get the right to work if you have one grandparent that is born in Britain. Now think about that for a moment. Who is likely to have one grandparent born in Britain? People from those white settler colonies. South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Not likely anyone who comes from India and Pakistan or Bangladesh, or anyone who comes from Africa or comes from the Caribbean. That is an example, I would say, of a race-based form of legislation. It discriminates, it decides it's going to put on who it's going to advantage. And so what I would say is that the British state is built upon a whole set of policies and practices that are either directly racist in the sense in which they directly set out to determine one group to be advantaged or another, or sometimes it's indirect. Sometimes that's not its intent, but its actualities, the actual working of it, ends up advantaging one group or another. So essentially, that's racism, basic sort of 101. But of course, the truth is, people do PhDs on this stuff. So it's a massive subject.
Thank you very much for kind of taking us through the history of race and racism. But how would you say it resonates today in the UK and in comparison to the US? And we'll go on to the Black Lives Matters in a second. But how are we seeing it exposed in society?
Yeah, I think the essential differences are really in terms of how it is projected and how it is perceived, more so than its actual working. So actually, if you look at the demographics, for example, in America and the UK, in terms of white people's lives, their life expectancy, the type of jobs they do, how much money they earn, where they live, there's not a huge difference really between black people in America, African Americans, and black people in Britain, really. Therefore, what that tells me is that systemically how both nations operate, underpinned by and influenced by race, are relatively similar. The difference, I think, comes in terms of the extent to which this is made more manifest, I think, within America. So in America, I think one of the fundamental differences that slavery, for example, was very much embedded into the nation in terms of its practices. So you had millions of slaves, millions of enslaved African people that eventually were freed. But of course, once they were freed, what I often say to people is slavery ended, but then racism continued. So people may be free, but they are still experiencing a harsher social environment and harsher economic experiences compared to white people. Now, in Britain, Britain's involved in slavery, but largely the slavery is overseas in terms of overseas territories, which doesn't mean that slaves were not in Britain, but not in millions of numbers, but more thousands of numbers. Therefore, there's a sense in which in America, America has never denied that it's been racist. It's just simply tried to find ways to justify it. Britain, I think, has been much more subtle in that for a long time, there was a denial of there was anything, such a thing as systemic racism. And for the most part, it tended to be more covert. So, for example, one of the examples I give, that in America, there used to be clear laws that were based on segregation about where you could live. And so there were legal provisions that said that African Americans could not live in particular places. This was a white-only place. Now, in Britain, conversely, there have been no, or I shouldn't say no, but there have been very few open laws that have said you can't live in a particular place. Yeah, actually, if you look at the demographics of where black and brown people live, so black and Asian people live, we still tend to live in the same places that we lived actually when we came in terms of mass migration. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you go to a place like Bradford or Leicester, or you go to or if you go to West London, or maybe parts of South London, basically large industrial cities, like you'll find lots of black and Asian people. Mm-hmm. But if you go to Devon and Cornwall, hardly anyone. You go to East Anglia, hardly anyone. You go to Buckinghamshire and those kind of very, very kind of posh middle class, hardly anyone. So actually, there's still lots of places where black and Asian people don't live. Now, unlike America, that's not about laws, that's about economics, that if places are very expensive, you can't afford to live there. It's also about a much more informal colour bar, as they used to call it. So back in the 50s, like you'd have things like that landlords would say, have signs outside, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. That wasn't a law that said that black people couldn't move in those places, but landlords simply would not rent a room, or people would not allow you to buy a house. So my parents talk about that when they were looking to buy a house in the early 60s, they went to different areas, and the areas that were all white, that most of the residents made a pact with each other that if they were selling their house, they would not sell it to a black family. Basically, it's always been slightly more covert, and therefore it wasn't until the death of Stephen Lawrence and then the Macpherson report that we finally had the British state admitting what black and brown people had known for decades, years, that Britain is a racist society. And therefore, I think a key difference has always been that the British state has always tried to avoid it. So even now, even recently, we've had the Prime Minister saying that, in his opinion, he does not think that Britain is a racist country. Now, Trump doesn't say that. Trump says, well, basically, he believes that white people are superior. He believes that white people have civilized the country and they've worked hard and therefore they deserve what they get. He's not denying it, he's justifying it. In Britain, we still have a Prime Minister that says, even though the figures for the deaths of COVID-19 shows economic disparity that impacts upon people of African descent, that makes us more vulnerable to deaths, it's there in front of us. It's not genetics where we're dying, it's our postcode. It's where we live, and it's the jobs we do for which we cannot self-isolate. That's why we're dying. And he still turns around and says, yeah, but in my opinion, we're not a racist country, like we're a country of decency and fair play. So, so I think a fundamental difference has always been trying to uncover racism in the first place and trying to show its existence against the operations, I would say, of white supremacy that has always tried to pretend that it doesn't, or try to find other reasons to excuse, like the lack or the relative lack of success and development of Black and Asian peoples compared to non-white, compared particularly to white middle class people.
Thank you. My next question kind of follows suit, really, in kind of getting to what's been the topical issue. What is the Black Lives Matter movement? And perhaps could you touch upon, the emergence of the movement? I mean, it's recently getting attention, but it's been through since 2013. And also perhaps what are the demands of the movement?
Yeah. Okay. So the Black Lives Matter movement really starts soon after the acquittal of George Zimmerman. So George Zimmerman is a white man who effectively stalks a Black teenager, a guy called Trayvon Martin, and claims that he is shooting in self-defense, even though Trayvon Martin is unarmed, and Trayvon Martin actually is trying to avoid a confrontation. Essentially, George Zimmerman tracks him down and kills him. Gets brought to court. He is exonerated, so he does not go to prison. And that is just yet another death of a unarmed Black person at the hands of white people, either police or, in this case, a civilian person who have guns and take the law into their own hands. And so Black Lives Matter really starts from that particular moment. But I think it's worth saying that there has been a kind of Black Lives Matter movement long before that. So essentially, like the civil rights movement is essentially still a Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Power movement is still essentially a Black Lives Matter movement, going right back into the early part of the 20th century and the mass movement created by a guy called Marcus Garvey, who was a Black nationalist leader, very active across the whole of America, but particularly in New York in the 1920s. Again, it's a kind of Black Lives Matter movement. And what all of them are saying is, America's a racist country in which Black lives are not even protected by the law. So even when someone like George Martin has been proved, he's lying. He's not in fear of self-defense. He kills this person in cold blood and goes to a court, and a jury of mainly white people say he's not guilty. That is not that different from what happens in 1955. The name escapes me. There's Emmett Till. So there's a teenage boy called Emmett Till who's from the North and goes to the South to visit his family and whistles at a white woman, whistles at her, which is obviously taboo in terms of the etiquette around how Black people should behave around white people. This is 1955. And he's kidnapped by a group of white people who beat and dismember his body and throw him into the river. They find his body. They find the white men who do it. They go on trial. All of them are found not guilty. So the sense in which, like, the Black Lives Matter movement is just the latest incarnation of attempts, particularly by African American communities, to organize or protest against a racist society in which white violence could be unleashed against black people with no legal redress for black communities. So essentially what Black Lives Matter have been arguing really since 2013 is a number of things. One is that they want, certainly they want the police force to be reformed and there to be a different way in which they judge the ethics of the police. Because oftentimes like, there's a very low threshold on which they're allowed to pull their guns and shoot someone. So there's that. They want reform in systems around the court. So again, to the best of my knowledge, I stand to be correct on this, but I think I'm right in saying that I'd like to say pride, but obviously, like we don't know what's going to happen with the people who killed George Floyd. But all the people who killed black people before, not one of them ever went to prison. That what happened mostly is that they were allowed to resign their jobs, but do no jail time. So, of course, what they also want is a reform of the court system. So really, it's really about changing the practices and policies that allow racist violence, particularly violence, to be unleashed and for perpetrators never to be found guilty. That's really how the movement kind of started. It wants education. It wants, obviously, clearly there's something deficient in an education system that allows white people now, even in 2020, still to believe all the rhetoric around race. As I said right at the start of this conversation, it's a fiction. It's a myth. There was no evidence for it whatsoever. Every test that has been tried to devise to prove that white people are superior has utterly failed because it's a nonsense. And yet people still believe it. They still believe in a sense of entitlement for a particular group of people over against others. So there's something about, so what's wrong with the education system that still allows this to happen, both in terms of education in school, but higher education. So there's a whole set of specific and more general demands that they want around society being restructured, systems being changed, but particularly the policies around guns and I think also who owns them and them being so for example, when Obama president, he tried to bring in gun control, and that was defeated by the National Rifle Association, the NRA, which is the large right-wing, white majority. I mean, I'm sure there are some black and brown people in it, but it's mainly white people who are defending their right to bear arms. And I think if you're being critical and crude about it, it's right to bear arms so you can kill black people. Obviously, and this is when it started, there was a Black Lives Matter movement in Britain, but obviously it was tiny in comparison. And largely because our racism has always been not as visceral, it's not as in your face as it is in America. I would probably say that the movement didn't really take off initially in Britain, even though we have also had our issues around violence against black people. So when we think, for example, of what happened to I've got his name now, to Lawrence. What? Sorry, it sort of got out of my head. Sorry. Oh gosh, the black teenager who was killed. So I can remember his parents' names, like Dorian and Neville Lawrence. I just can't remember his name, which is embarrassing and shameful. That'll probably come back to me in a moment. But even so, there have been occasions where black people have been murdered, and the police have not been able to solve it. I went on a march. The first march I ever went on was in 1992 in Wolverhampton, and on that occasion there was a African Caribbean man called Clinton McKerbin who went into a shop and was using a stolen credit card, and the police were called and they came and they arrested him, and he resisted arrest as they were arresting to put him into the van, and he was pinned to the floor, and a number of men sat on his back. One sat on his neck. Not for 8 minutes 46 seconds, I don't think, but he still died in police custody. And when there was an inquest, it was death by misadventure. No police were ever arrested. And there was a large march which I went on in order to protest about the fact that this guy had died in police custody. A few years later, there was a woman called Joy Gardner, and she was a Jamaican woman, I believe, and she was in Britain illegally. She was seen as an illegal alien, so to speak. An illegal immigrant, and the police came to arrest her on the tip-off, and so they grabbed her and took her out of the house, and they put masses of duct tape around her mouth in order to restrain her, because like she was shouting and seemingly sort of behaving sort of hysterically. And and in the midst of that, she had a panic attack and then had an asthma attack and died. Inquest, investigation. No one's arrested. So we've had our own issues around Black deaths in custody, Black deaths through racist attacks and murders, and that has helped to propel our own sort of Black Lives Matter movement. Its growth across the world is really on the basis, again, of this fiction of race that didn't exist, but yet Black lives seemingly don't matter in terms of our deaths, premature deaths, and the impact of racism that affects us in terms of all aspects of our life, in terms of employment, in terms of if we have jobs, then we get paid less money than white people. Promotions, we get less of that. There are whole areas of work where we don't even figure at all, because it's almost like a white-only zone in terms of who gets employed. Everything. So basically, it's this look at the systemic way in which racism operates. So really, that's the Black Lives Matter, but both in terms of its roots, but also in terms of the work that it's been doing in many white majority societies, such as Britain. But again, I think as I said, I think it's worth reminding us that, like, although the movement started in 2013, there has been something like Black Lives Matter in every year of the 20th century. That there has always been different organizations of Black protests against racism.
So, I mean, perhaps we could, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, say that the kind of slogan or the title of Black Lives Matter may have been something that originated in the US, but I think there's a global growing community and a global growing solidarity amongst it. And people are looking into the injustices in their own societies, in their own countries, and kind of uniting under the same umbrella. Would that be a fair way of summarizing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's also a link to Black Lives Matter and to, if you think across the globe in terms of also anti-colonial, anti-globalization movements that are often about indigenous people, Black and brown people who have been impoverished in their own countries, have been subject to systemic policies that largely come from the West, particularly from North America, that have impacted upon them. They may not necessarily call themselves Black Lives Matter movements, but I think their desire and quest for equity and for justice for the people in their various countries are very much taking inspiration from Black Lives Matter. So yeah, I mean, I would agree. I don't think it's necessarily just the specific movement itself with a specific name. It's also the way in which it's created allies amongst other movements that are essentially sort of trying to fight not dissimilar forms of sort of systemic racism and injustice.
And on to our next question. I mean, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement kind of dominate social media and create its own agenda within social media. But then, of course, in contrast to that, you kind of have the counter movement. So the All Lives Matter movements, for example, saying that, saying Black Lives Matter in itself is a racist phenomenon. How would you respond to that? So does saying Black Lives Matter actually mean all lives don't matter, or is there a way of understanding it?
Yeah. I think first it's important to say that white lives matter is a racist way of trying to deflect away from the actuality of Black suffering. That's what it is. Because let's put it this way. Before Black Lives Matter started and Black people were being killed with impunity and our lives were being decimated, I didn't see white people talking about all lives matter. Because here's the thing, that because of systemic racism, white lives have always mattered. There's never needed to be a movement to talk about white lives, because guess what? Their lives have always mattered. You simply look at the figures, and the figures tell you that white people's lives, for the most part, even the poorest white people are still better off than most Black people. So, so therefore, Black Lives Matter does not mean all lives don't matter. It is to point to a specific phenomena of Black deaths, of Black injustice. That's a specific thing. But I think part of the problem with the people who talk about all lives matter actually comes from this quote. There's a great quote. So one of my heroes is a woman called Katie Cannon, Katie Cannon, and she was she died sadly last year. She was a Black woman, sort of religious scholar, an ethicist. So her job was to look at particularly religious ethics. How do people behave? What governs our behavior? What counts as good moral behavior? And Katie Cannon had this quote when the Black Lives Matter started, and then people started to push back with all lives matter. She says, when entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. When entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. So what have we had thus far is entitlement, a society built upon notions of race in which white people have expected and have prospered at the expense of Black and brown people. Absolutely, completely. Black Lives Matter says this is wrong, and what we want is equality. We're not looking to take over, we're not looking to grab everything. All we're simply saying is that at the present, in terms of social relations, terms of power, terms of systems, they are so heavily weighted in favor of one group, i.e. white people. So Black Lives Matter says, well, actually what we need is reform, restructure, new policies and practices that will mean that our lives matter to the extent whereby there's greater equality. But because most of our societies in the West have been created on the basis of white entitlement, suddenly Black lives doesn't seen as equality, it's seen as they're losing out and somehow this is unfair. So again, that's to go back to Katie Cannon's quote. When entitlement is the norm, the problem is white people don't even recognize their entitlement. White people don't even recognize the fact that systems of power built upon notions of race have advantaged them. So they have a lot of unearned entitlement. So one of the things I often say when I teach issues around race is to say to white people that actually one of your advantages is that you can wake up without even having to think about being white. Every Black person wakes up, and we know that the whole of our life is dominated by the fact that constructs of race means that I just walk into a shop and people look at me differently. I stand in a lift and I hold the doors, and a white person walks by and says, no, actually, I'll take the stairs, or I'll wait for the next one because I don't want to get in and alongside you. They don't know anything about me, but what they see and my physicality as a Black body is seen as a problem. So Black Lives Matter is trying to wrestle with all those issues of race built upon white entitlement that have been going for centuries. But as I said, because white people don't recognize their entitlement, when they see Black Lives Matter, they don't see the push for equality that they themselves have been largely preventing. Not saying every white person wakes up and does this, it's a system that they help to contribute to that creates this. what they see is not equality or the push for equality. What they see is somehow black people try to get an unfair advantage and they've been disadvantaged. White people don't have to fear for the police shooting them in America because by and large, it's black people who get shot. Whatever Donald Trump tried to say recently in a press release that white people get shot more than black people, utter nonsense. There was empirical figures to show that African Americans make up 12% of the population and yet make up over 3 times that in terms of people who were killed by the police. Therefore, Black Lives Matter is about saying there are specifics. It's a bit like when people sort of say, well, people who are dying of cancer is important. And someone says, no. All people who are sick matters. Well, yeah, of course, all people who are sick, but let's look at specifics that impact upon a particular group. Black Lives Matter has never meant that all lives don't matter. It's simply saying if all lives did matter, then we wouldn't need a Black Lives Matter movement in the first place.
I think that's put very, very straight to the point and a lovely kind of swift answer together. Just going to go to the last of my few questions coming in through YouTube. In the UK, at least, we're coming to the end of the lockdown phase of the pandemic and going to what many of us now call a new normal. Do you see any concrete changes being made? How have the protests over the summer? Do you see it being reflected in policy? And if yes, how? If no, what could be done further?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how our new normal will be that different, actually. I mean, I would like it to be, because I think what COVID-19 has shown us is that the old normal wasn't great for black people. In terms of our deaths, in terms of our disproportionate number of deaths, compared to our numbers in society. So my fear is that in order to go back to normal, we will be potentially put back into vulnerable positions. So, for example, when the Prime Minister says, now it's important that all of us go back to work. Well, firstly, we have to recognize that the virus is still out there. It hasn't been conquered. We don't have a vaccine for it yet. So therefore, there is still the potential for people to catch it and die. And what the figures have shown us is that if you're black or brown, and if you live in particular parts of the UK, you're more likely to die. We're still therefore more likely to die by going back to normal. Now, I accept that something has that essentially we have to try and affect some way of kickstarting the economy. I accept that. But my fear is, and it's not a fear I share, I hold, it's a fear that a number of my black friends and colleagues hold, is that we are not desperate like to go back into social situations anytime soon. So, I mean, I'm not much of a drinker anyway. So, so I can't say I spent a lot of time in pubs anyway, but trust me, you could not pay me to go into a pub anytime soon. But therefore, I fear for the people who have to work in pubs, for the people who have to work in those social situations, coming from cultural and ethnic backgrounds that make them susceptible to increased danger of a virus that has not gone anywhere. It's still out there. And my fear also is that I think, if I'm being blunt, we have a government that has shown lip service in its commitment to protect all people. Vince, about Boris Johnson, about efficacy of Boris Johnson's attitude to minorities, given the fact that this is a man who has made racist statements in the past and never apologized for them. So basically, if he can make racist statements about us and not apologize for them, I refuse to believe that he has my best interests at heart when he's looking to open up the economy in order that white people actually can go back and make more money again. So I'm suspicious and I'm concerned, but I accept that obviously we can't stay locked down forever. but I'm fearful about re-entering a new normal when the old normal was not great. I think I also have, a lot of deep concerns really for the National Health Service and for the people who work in that. I listened to a documentary on the BBC World Service that was based in Bradford. So Bradford's my home city. So although I lived in Birmingham for 36 years, this is a good Yorkshire accent. And so coming from Bradford, listen to that. And Bradford's a city with a significant Muslim community, but also a significant African and Caribbean community. So it's been a city that's had migration built into it for the last 50, 60 years. And it's interesting that the disproportionate deaths, particularly amongst Muslims in the city, is not just people who live in the community, but also it's the Muslims who work within the health service in the hospitals in which I was born, the hospitals where I have been in actually when I was younger, when I wasn't well. And so disproportionate numbers of people who work in the health service that is still underfunded, despite what the government tells you. That there will always be people who will be at the sharp end through their service and are vulnerable to continued ill health and possible death. So I'm always slightly cynical about people getting up and clapping and saying how wonderful it is, our health service, and then voting for a party that has consistently underfunded it. That Labour's not perfect. Let me just say that right out, that Labour Party historically has been as racist in terms of protecting whiteness and white entitlement as the Conservatives has. But at least the health service was a creation of the Labour government, and therefore I've never been convinced about the Conservatives' desire to protect it, given the fact that you look at the history of it, and they were the ones who were implacably opposed to it being created in the first place. Therefore, I think we need to ask ourselves, if we really do value the health service, then our nurses need more pay rather than they need more clapping.
Thank you. Thank you for the critical response. I'm just looking over the questions that we've got through from YouTube now. The first one is, I don't see much support for the movement from some parts of the world, say Eastern Europe and Africa. How does the movement resonate across Africa in terms of people and leadership? What is the position of the African Union?
Yeah. I think there's probably, again, I suspect there are lots of very, very deep fundamental reasons for its lack of support in those two places. But I think there's two immediate things that strike me. That really, for Black Lives Matter to really be significant, what you need is two things. One is you need a significant expression of white power, of white people who hold the reins of power and control systems and structures. Then also what you then need is a significant, probably Black minority who live in those same countries and are experiencing racism. So in Africa, what you have, with the exception of South Africa and Zimbabwe, so basically countries north of what's called the Limpopo River, are Black majority countries. That's not to say that there's not discrimination and there's not injustice in those places, but it's not necessarily about a white power system that's imposing it on Black people. That actually one of the things that's interesting about in the language of Blackness, that it tends to be used in places of the diaspora, so i.e. where people of African descent have travelled largely involuntarily through slavery. So actually one of the quizzes I sometimes say to people is that the country with most Africans in it is Nigeria. What's the second most country with most Africans in it? Actually, that's Brazil. So Brazil has more Black people of African descent in it than any other country on the continent of Africa, with the exception of Nigeria. That shows you how many people were trafficked across. So Black Lives Matter, therefore, largely needs white power versus Black minority and oppression. Africa tends to be, for the most part, most of the countries are Black countries themselves. whereby the people probably won't even call themselves black. They'll just say, actually, like, we're Africans. Or we'll probably say, actually, no, we're not Africans. They will say, actually, I'm Nigerian. Or they might say, actually, I come from Ghana. Or actually, I come from Kenya. I come from Tanzania. I come from Uganda. Actually, like, they may not even say that. They may say, actually, I come from my particular ethnic group. I'm Hausa. I'm Yoruba. These are groups in Nigeria. Therefore, it's not taken off. It doesn't mean that there are not anti-colonial or nationalist groups within that who are fighting for justice, but they may not necessarily use the language of Black Lives Matter because these are black majority countries where the assumption is that most of the population is black and they matter. Eastern Europe, again, I think the opposite. Lots of white people, but not significant, historically not significant black communities in Eastern Europe. Therefore, if you don't have a significant community that has enough visibility to mount a Black Lives Matter movement, that's not to say that black people don't live there in relatively smaller numbers, and that's not to say that they're not oppressed either. But it's just that, as I said, I think you need particular conditions in order to have a specific Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you, Professor. The next question's about Generation Z. It says that it seems to be that Generation Z leads the Black Lives Matter, at least in social media in the US, which is essentially informing and mobilizing people to a great extent. Do you think this will lead to more racial tension among future generations in the US and beyond? Or perhaps we could expand the question to say, is that why elderly populations who are perhaps not using social media as much, not as involved in the debate?
Yeah. I mean, I at this point, I will also defer to a point made by David Olusaga, so that's the well-known sort of black historian over here. And a number of weeks ago, he was asked a question about, well, so how significant is this movement? What do you think is its significance in the future? And he said, well, I'm a historian. He says, I don't know. They're like, we will have to wait to the future to look back to see how significant this is. I will probably borrow that answer to say that I think how significant this will be in terms of this younger generation using social media, that whether that will lead to more racism or less, I don't know. There's a sense in which actually one can make an argument for either case. You could either say that one of the things that we see through the impact of better education around citizenship in America and in the UK is that, according to some evidence in terms of data, that younger people have a capacity to appreciate difference and to be less fixated on the construct of race than older people. So one of the things I hope for, actually, when I think of my nephew, I don't have children, but my brother has a son, he's Noah, who's 17, he'll be 18 in September. And if I look at Noah's life, his life is much more cosmopolitan than mine. He has friends from every single ethnic group. I mean, admittedly, he lives in London. Every ethnic group. He does not seem as wedded to notions of difference in the ways in which, when I was growing up in Bradford in the 70s and 80s, there were areas where literally, if you were a black person, you did not go because of racism and violence. That does not seem to be part of his historical experience. And these are Snapchat, Instagram, everything. I mean, Facebook's old hat for him. I mean, I'm a kind of sort of Facebook and Twitter man. He's doing all kind of stuff I don't know about. So at one level, I'm hoping that will be better. The problem is that what we also see from social media is that in some respects it makes us more tribal. And by that I mean that social media and the disinformation that it can propagate can allow us to be in our silos where we are getting very clear forms of disinformation and distorted information, what Trump would call falsehood, fake news. Although ironically, it's a bit ironic that he's saying it because he's benefiting more from fake news than anyone else has. But even so, that tendency could mean that what we also then see is a kind of white backlash. So even amongst younger people, this sense of resentment of other people taking over things and somehow displacing them. So a lot of scholars talk about white fragility, and white fragility is just this sense of even when people are entitled and have the advantage, they still feel vulnerable to the notion that somehow other people are taking things off them, even though the evidence shows that's clearly not the case. And so I think, if I'm honest with you, like I think the jury's out on that, I mean, I'm 55, I'll be 56 in October. This is a whole world that I know nothing of. So, so I really don't know, if I'm honest.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, you said you didn't know, but you provided both arguments of, so thank you. Just two final questions. How do we remember the past and those who committed crimes and perpetuated great injustices? Some argue that removing their traces from public also removes social history of our social history. I think this could probably be associated with, the removal of
yeah. Again, I think this then goes back. It's a similar question to the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter argument. At the moment, we don't even have a proper retelling of British history anyway. So it's not as if we're starting from a neutral position, that somehow that what we have is lots of different activities from history, and taking away a statue or other statues is robbing us of that. What we have is a whitewashing of British history anyway. So for the most part, we have all kinds of aspects of the British Empire that we don't talk about. So, for example, I was saying in another talk that when we look at the Holocaust and we say it's truly terrible, clearly it is. What we don't realize is that actually concentration camps were invented by the British. We experimented with concentration camps when fighting the Boer War against the Boers. These were white South Africans in Southern Africa at the end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. We British invented concentration camps. When we look at apartheid, we say it was terrible. There's this thing about displacing people from land and stealing land and separating them on the basis of race. Well, guess what? The British invented that as well. So, firstly, let's have a proper retelling of all aspects of British Empire. I'm not arguing that everything the British did is bad. I'm not saying that. That would be simplistic. But what I'm saying is, at the moment, what we have is a treatment of history that largely seeks to exonerate what the British have done and is very selective about the bits we teach. So therefore, let's have a much more complex and nuanced understanding of the history. That's the first thing. Secondly, it is a fiction to say that statues teach us history. No one ever walked past a statue and said, oh, I'm looking at a statue. Oh, now I understand history. It is a nonsense. Therefore, actually removing it, well, first things first, most of us don't even know it's statues. I guess most people actually walk past statues. I'm at the statues in Birmingham. I remember when we met in 2007, we met the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, and there was a big statue about a couple of miles from where I live to a major anti-slavery guy. This is someone who was on the good side of history. And I'll be honest with you, I must have walked past that statue 1,000 times, never saw it. It was only when we had this particular trail. And someone said, well, this is a statue to this guy in Birmingham who was very active in fighting slavery and was one of the anti-slavery leaders. And I thought, blimey, I've never seen that before. If someone took that down, that would not suddenly deprive us of history, because guess what? Books teach us history. Statues don't teach us history. And therefore, removing it doesn't take us away from history. I think the other thing I would say as well, in particular that particular statue, for 30 years, people have been asking for the statue to be moved to a museum. So actually, let's put it in a museum. Let's put it in a museum and have a proper historical display in order to talk about this guy's life. So yes, in this case, Edward Colston, he was a slave owner who made, no, slave trader, sorry, who made equivalent of billions out of slave trade, but then was a philanthropist who gave lots of money to the school and built schools, or gave schools his names and built civic things. A statue doesn't tell you any of those things. A statue is just a monument to the people who we think are great. And the idea of having a statue to a slave trader is as absurd and as horrific as having a statue to a good Nazi. I don't see statues like the good Nazis anywhere, because actually, by definition, Nazis were not good. Slave traders were not good either. But I would say, to be very clear, what we need is a comprehensive analysis of our history. That's the first thing. And secondly, statues don't teach us history.
Thank you very much, Professor. Just final remarks. I mean, I'd like to thank you for being here with us today, and for all our viewers. I'd like to end with a final question, though, because I think it's a question that kind of sums up everything we've been discussing today. How does Black Lives Matter fit into the UK context? I mean, it's something that we've been discussing throughout, and the question goes on to how is it different or similar from the US experience? Could you possibly just summarize that in a few words?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's smaller. Mm-hmm. It's not as potent as the one in America, because obviously it started in America, and obviously it was largely responding to the deaths of people being, well, African Americans being shot and killed. You know, I mean, we don't have legal guns in this country, so there's essentially some of the most visible symbols of white supremacy are not the same ones that we have. So in a sense, I think our experience is about much more about systemic and racism and the kind of infrastructure of Black lives not mattering in terms of COVID-19, in terms of immigration, in terms of these hostile environments. So, for example, to give one very quick example, so we had like the Windrush scandal. So these were people like of my parents' generation and their descendants who came to Britain as legal British subjects. Whilst they're here, Britain changes the law that changes their status, and therefore they are then deemed illegal when they have done nothing wrong. All they have done is just work and be regular citizens in a country. That then ends up deporting them. We are still waiting for justice for them. We're still waiting for justice, like for the Grenfell, for the people in Grenfell Tower. Disproportionate number of black and brown people died in that fire, and we're still waiting for any legal redress. So far, no one's gone to prison. No one has been held accountable for what was clearly substandard housing, where the cladding and various other regulations were not adhered to. That is probably not as glamorous. I say glamorous, sorry, that's the wrong term, obviously. It's not as visible and maybe not as jarring as seeing a black man being murdered in front of you with a foot, with a knee on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. But those people who died in the fire at Grenfell still died on the back of white supremacist policies that allowed it to happen. So I think our movement is not as visible, but it's still necessary in this country.
Thank you very much, and I think we can wrap it up and end on your final words. Thank you very much. Thank you for our viewers and for the questions. Thank you, Professor.
Indeed, yes, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.